Okay, so we're going to be looking at movements of the early 20th century. Kind of got a little taste of that last week, but we're going to look at more of this stuff that kind of answers the question what leads us to World War II. So, this is a lot more of these isms that we've covered in early modern history. Okay, so the first like philosophy is one that started in the late 19th century, um, but since his major work came out at the beginning of the 20th century, his influence is a lot has a lot more influence, has a lot more impact, excuse me, on the 20th century, and that is Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis. And so, like, basically, the school of thought of psychology becomes a major science. Obviously, that's the case today. So Freud was successful in doing this, and his main contributions is well, in some ways, he's kind of seen an extension of the other great late 19th century thinkers whose influence on the 20th century and even today is still impactful. That is Marx and Nietzsche, the great skeptics. So, anyways, and you think about all the followers their philosophies had on the modern philosophical world. I think that is important. Now, um, kind of keep this short, Freud is important for, let's just boil it down to two things outside of, psychology becoming an important science. The first thing is he basically, for all his wanting to keep things rational and scientific, he basically introduced the active split mind. So, in other words, if you look all the way back to like the Enlightenment era, 18th century Enlightenment, this idea of like this rational mindset that Descartes and Kant were arguing for. Freud basically says like, no, the mind's actually way more complex. In fact, there's this subconscious to it, and there's the way he put it was there's the id, the ego, and the superego, and the mind's in conflict. And this is why Freud studied dreams. I think dreams kind of gave you a glimpse into the desires of the mind. So that's one. He's able to like usher that era in. Um, and then the other thing was is that he believed that there's one reason with psychology he believed that you can actually try to cure people from these phobias and anxieties, and oftentimes the dreams or little things that we would do subconsciously would tell him or any other analyst, what possibly could be the problem. So that's the main thing. Father psychoanalysis, not psychology. Psychology exists before Freud, but this popular view of psychoanalysis is what Freud ushers in. And then finally, I posted a letter between Freud and Einstein, and you can kind of see Freud anticipation of like World War II in that letter when Einstein, the great scientist with his theory of relativity, was also somebody very involved in the League of Nations. He you asked Freud, whose reputation is already global at this point, hey, what are ways we can make the world a better place? And Freud just sees this kind of propensity of violence, this sense of death drive that humanity has, that happiness is not possible. So that is Freud. the video I posted last week that's over there to the right shows his influence on the artistic world with surrealism. So make sure to check that out if you have not. Okay, so let's look at the three countries that are going to be making waves as the Axis powers. The first one is the Japanese. So modern Japan is a really fascinating story. It goes from basically isolated, then the Americans show up and the Europeans, and then with the Meiji restoration of the empire of the emperor, um, modernizes, industrializes really quick, then becomes a wannabe imperial nation, at least in Asia, turn of the century. Within the 1920s, it actually goes into this whole era of basically their own roaring 20s. However, all their desires to be treated as an equal among the other powers is basically thwarted, um, m- mostly because of racism, just not including Japan in like the big boys club, basically. And so once the depression hits, this is kind of the story for both Japan and Germany and many other nations. But when the depression hit, it hit Japan pretty hard. And so this allowed very anti-Western, particularly anti-American feeling to go into Japan, and that the military basically took over. So this really xenophobic imperialism takes over Japan. And by the time the early 30s begin, before Hitler's even a household name, Japan is starting to conquer its Asian neighbors. And everybody talks about the Nazi sense of ethnic purity. The Japanese had similar ones, and you can see this with some of the atrocities that happened, especially like in Nanjing, this infamous, um, basically ethnic cleansing, rape, pillaging, and you can see the the photo here illustrates it right here, or just take a look at it. So that's Japan. Now, fascism, and there's some videos attached that you could take a look at, but fascism is one of the isms that pops up right after World War One. It's an overused term today, in my opinion, but it actually has historical roots with Benito Mussolini and Italian politics. Now, the first few points you can read is basically like the encyclopedia definition, textbook definition of fascism. So that's what defines it, as opposed to other isms. It tends to be very right wing. So a lot of people, like I said, I try to hold on to it, connect it to its historical roots, and that's what it is. Because what I mean by that is right wing tends to be like overtly conservative, and if you look at the last point, it tends to like put all its chips in the military, among the masses, um, and like family values and churches. So that's why it tends to be more right wing. Um, so, and then it tends to be very against any kind of progressive leftist politics. And in Italy, when Mussolini gained power, just for example, they there was like violence in the streets over this, and many of the major socialist communists were sent to prison and executed. So similar thing will happen in Germany when the Nazis gain power. So Mussolini is a force to be reckoned with in Italy, and I do encourage you to watch this video here, um, because it's pretty disturbing. You can kind of see um, the fascist leader at work in the way the crowds, massive crowds, come out to hear him speak. This picture here shows this is from Germany, but it shows this power. You got Lutheran ministers and Nazi leaders, all saluting at the same time. So just some examples. Um, so Mussolini, in Italy, where nationalism was like a really common phenomenon throughout 19th century Italian politics, all the way back from Mazzini. And actually, Italian nationalism was kind of the foundational nationalism for many other movements globally. So, some really interesting books written on that lately because oftentimes we forget about that. So, one of the things about Italy getting even in the war was to like this kind of very mythological heroism about like war bringing a nation together and making a nation stronger. So when World War One didn't work out that way, Mussolini kind of took that energy, personified it, and began to like rally the man on the quote unquote man on the street to his party. And so he was able to do this, and famously, the crowds like propelled him to march on Rome, and he was named the leader, El Duce, in the mid 20s. So he was a fascist leader that actually was very inspirational for Hitler, and probably from all global leaders was Hitler's greatest confidant. All right, so let's talk about the Nazis. So Hitler is one of those figures that, a solitary guy, you could argue, without Hitler, this probably wouldn't happen. I think that's actually pretty safe to say. So Hitler was a fascist leader. He comes to power very, very upset at the way Germany was handled after World War One, right, where Britain and France basically called the shots. And so he gets in touch with this group of radicals, and eventually tries to overthrow the government in Munich in 1923. Doesn't go well. He's arrested. Only serves about about a year. And during that time, that's where he writes his book Mein Kampf, My Struggle. And there you start to see his anti-Semitism coming through. With the depression, the global depression that hits in the late 20s, early 30s, this spells a doom for the Weimar Republic. Many Germans saw the Weimar Republic as kind of like Anglo-American political system being forced upon them, even though, as we saw last week, it was a time of like art and philosophy and literature to kind of explode, especially like in the realm of cinema. So it falls apart. Hitler and the Nazis begin to get a greater hearing. And so the government, the conservative government, mostly made up of industry and the military, who is tired of the Weimar Republic anyways, decide to kind of like bring Hitler into their camp, make him chancellor. Because at this point, the government has a two-headed system. There's a chancellor and president. So the World War One General Hindenburg is the president, Hitler's chancellor, and immediately he goes to work as chancellor. He basically takes on emergency powers within months of becoming chancellor, and starts to initiate laws that are going to be anti-Semitic. They're going to push Germany to be militaristic, even though the Treaty of Versailles forbid it. Hitler just doesn't care because he feels like the other European powers aren't going to stop him. When Hindenburg dies in 34, so just about a year later, he takes the presidency and the chancellor and puts fashions one political position called the Führer, or the leader. So basically, by a year after becoming chancellor, he becomes dictator of Germany, and then slowly but surely, the Nuremberg laws against the Jews go into effect. And as I mentioned, industry and military puts a lot of money into that, a lot of energy into that, and so to get Germany ready for this great war he has or is planning out.